Welcome to Lake SWCD's presentation on wetlands for our 2020 Online Education Initiative. The first question we need to ask ourselves is, what are wetlands? Like the waiting place in Oh, the Places You'll Go, wetlands are the in-between place between land and water, a magical place where anything can happen. Wetlands are also like the kidneys of the earth. They purify the waters that pass through them and distill out poisonous sediments, chemicals, and pollutants, just like kidneys do in the human body. Wetlands purify waste matter through a natural process of oxidation, radiation, biodegradation, and pisciculture, or fish cultivation. Wetlands also regulate and maintain the planet's air and water cycles, including levels of oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, methane, and carbon dioxide. They act as a huge carbon dioxide sink. Why are we here talking about wetlands today? Why do we even care? Well, wetlands are really wonderful. They can be cool places to visit for recreation, especially in coastal areas like mangrove wetlands. They also mitigate sea level rise and buffer landscapes from storms. They control floodwaters, help provide water storage areas for year-round fertile crops, and they filter harmful pollutants. Wetlands and their ability to hold back floodwaters have actually prevented over $30 billion per year in flood damage in the U.S. alone. Plus, over 43% of threatened and endangered species depend on wetland habitat, especially birds. Migratory birds use different types of wetlands for habitat and nutritional needs during migration. Overall, wetlands in the United States support about 5,000 plant species, 190 amphibian species, and 1/3 of all birds. Half to 2/3 of America's wild ducks hatch in the prairie pothole regions of the Dakotas, Iowa, and Minnesota, a wetland. Do wetlands need our help? Definitely. Between 1780 and 1980, the U.S. lost over 60 acres of wetlands per hour. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they document this and report on how wetlands are doing every year. In about 200 years during that period, we lost over 91% of wetlands in the entire United States. So they're worth protecting. But how did we lose so many wetlands? Most wetland losses have come from agricultural conversion, especially in the Midwest, or urban development. Before European settlement of North America, there was an estimated 220 million acres of wetlands in what is now the contiguous 48 states. About half of that acreage has disappeared, mostly drained for crop production. One of the largest projects in wetland drainages was the Dismal Swamp Drainage Company in Virginia and North Carolina. Wetland losses typical of European settlement have decreased significantly since the 1970s. This was in large part due to passage of the Clean Water Act at the federal level. So wetlands are now regulated and protected. The Clean Water Act is now overseen by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA. If you don't know about it yet, the Army Corps of Engineers is a cool branch of the federal government with jurisdiction or responsibility and power over navigable waters of the United States. For some or many states, the Army Corps is the only wetland regulator. Minnesota also has the Wetland Conservation Act to regulate and ensure no net loss of wetlands. In 1991, reacting to public concern about Minnesota's disappearing wetlands, the Minnesota legislature approved and Governor Arne Carlson signed the Wetland Conservation Act, one of the most sweeping wetland protection laws in the country. The legislature later amended the WCA, or Wetland Conservation Act, many times to accommodate the varying geographic needs in Minnesota. But the full program began in 1994 and continues to be implemented. The Wetland Conservation Act law and program's purpose is to maintain and protect Minnesota's wetlands and the benefits they provide, which is done through no net loss of wetlands. Any person proposing to drain, fill, or excavate a wetland must first avoid that. Second, they have to minimize their impact. And finally, they have to replace any lost wetland acres, functions, or values, such as by building a new wetland. In Lake County oversees the Wetland Conservation Act through facilitation of a technical evaluation panel and review of applications. The technical evaluation panel consists of an area DNR hydrologist, a representative from the Army Corps of Engineers, a representative from the SWCD, and a representative from the state agency Bowser, who oversees the overall wetland program. As a landowner in Lake County, if you are doing anything to a wetland, it needs to first be permitted by WACA or outlined for an exemption. If we're protecting these wetlands, it's really important to know how to recognize that it is a wetland. Therefore, we need to define them, and we need procedures for delineating where they start and where they end. So wetlands have a really special definition under the Wetland Conservation Act. They're areas that are inundated or saturated by ground or surface water at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, under normal circumstances, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Wetlands have to be even considered under the Wetland Conservation Act, they have to be less than 2 meters or 6.6 feet of water, which means they can't be a lake, and they have to have soil, and they have to be capable of supporting rooted emergent vegetation, meaning plants have to grow there. When professionals delineate or make a line around what is and what is not a wetland, they use some of the highlighted and bolded words in the definition I just read by looking at signs on the landscape to determine whether a wetland is a wetland. So for instance, they might look for inundation or saturation or ponding, water just sitting there. They might look for vegetation that is typical of a wetland, and they would want to make sure that it's not a drought year, so it's a normal circumstance, or that the wetland hasn't been altered in some way, like by development. And then lastly, they would look that the soil has water in it, or that it's hydric soil. Just for reference, when I say hydro or hydric, I'm talking about water and stuff related to water. This process for defining where a wetland is and what a wetland is and what might be regulated uses indicators. So like I said in the previous slide, basically indicators are like hydrology or water indicators. So inundation, saturation, there's water on the landscape, vegetation indicators, and soil indicators. This is Anocleus sensibilis, sensible fern. You can see the fern frond, and it's a more water loving fern plant. So if you look for different types of water loving or hydrophilic plants, you can see evidence for wetland areas. So you can see some hydrophilic plants here, like marshmallow marigolds, which